Thank you, Sophie, for the generous introduction, and thank you for the invitation. I'm really excited to be here. I'm very excited about some new and I would say fresh work that I'd like to share with you. Probably, like we all do, I put too many slides in here. I'll be rushed in the beginning. I'll try this strategy, and then more relaxed in the end. But basically, I think what really motivates... Oh, yeah, I think that's a reminder that I need to put this on. What really motivates this part of my research agenda is that when we talk about sorry.
It's okay.
I guess. Do you want to? Yeah. Okay. Great. Good. Sorry. Lost precious time. So when we look at inequalities and opportunity, we often care about what I would call sort of the holy trinity of stratification research. We look at the occupational status of parents. You know, sociologists especially like to do that as class, prestige, or something else. We look at their education. We look at their income. And still, what we do less often is we look at wealth. So wealth understood as the sum of all real and financial assets minus debt, or also known as net worth. So why might this be problematic? Well, first of all, wealth correlates much, the correlation between wealth and these characteristics is much lower than you would expect, and you'll see some of that. But second of all, it's a dimension of really extreme inequality, much more inequality than on any of these other dimensions. So for example, the Gini coefficient of income, depending on time and country, is somewhere around 0.4, 0.5. It's around 0.8 for wealth. And you may all know these statistics of the top wealth holders. And in fact, you most likely have been confronted with them recently. Wealth inequality on the rise, certainly in the public perception, once it makes it to Vanity Fair, by a, so I should say that, by a Nobel laureate, Stiglitz, that from that very statistic actually, it made it onto the Science and now into a very widely discussed book. I remind you that this 1%, 99% discussion comes from a statistic about the top 1% of wealth holders, not income holders. And the statistic being that the top 1% of wealth holders has 40% of all wealth. Well, that sort of push, has been continued in more recent work. So this is actually the share of total wealth, not among the top percent, but among the top 0.1%. And you see these broad historical tendencies, the last 100 years, comes down and comes up again to the level that we last saw in 1929, and not quite, a great setup to what happened afterwards. You can dig even deeper. You can go into, the 1% of the 1%, and the more you do that, the worse you feel. The more sorry you feel about millionaires, because they're really just, eking out their living, and it's the billionaires who take off. This is not the inequality I want to talk about today. In fact, the data I'm going to show you isn't even going to contain the 1%, not even the top 2%. The wealth inequality I'm going to talk about today is across the full distribution. And to give you a sort of a sense of this, I'm plotting here median net worth, so this total aggregate net wealth measure since the 80s, inflation adjusted relative to 1984. You see that median wealth up to 2007 increased quite nicely. That's a good start for the average American family. But the more you go up, the larger these increases were, right? This is the 75th percentile, 90th, 95th. So you see a real takeoff at the top, and when you go down, you see nothing happened really in the last 30 years, and then even before the recession, some decreases. The recession hits, I think, a quite stark picture. Everyone lost during the recession. In relative terms, however, the further you were down in the distribution, the more you lost. And of course, in absolute terms, there were millions of dollars lost at the top. But if you look at the long-term trends, the 95th and 90th percentile, they're still more than double, or about double where they were in the 80s, while the average American family is 20% below where it was in the 80s. So in 30 years, we have not made any progress. Okay, that's the kind of inequality I'm talking about. You could also do like ratios, right? So this came down a bit at the top in the dot-com bust, but in just 10 years, this relationship between the top and the middle has nearly doubled. I think that's a pretty stark trend. So the question here, however, is how does that inequality in wealth translate into inequality in opportunity in the next generation? And I'll leave you with a site here to read through. So we'll see, how is inequality in wealth related to opportunity? Like I said, I'm going to start out with something very descriptive and straightforward, but I think relatively new. A lot of these baseline things haven't been established. So I'll try to rush through them, and then I'll probably, hopefully, spend more time on getting to understand where these wealth effects come from, so about the mechanisms behind them. But let me know if you have questions, if you want me to go slower. Otherwise, I'll...
Just a point of clarification. So, on the definition of that word, house value is included in that? Pensions that people have?
To an extent. So pensions is actually a very good topic. If they're held in IRAs, they're included. If they're held in employer plans, they're not included here. And there is a big, so there's a long story, but the short story is whatever I've been showing you here is really an underestimate of inequality. A lot of what happened during the recession is people cashing in their pensions, which they now can do because they have defined contribution pensions as opposed to defined benefits. So they all cash them out, and we don't see that here. But we'll see it in 20 years when we have more poverty in old age. And then the other part is housing. It's a very interesting story, actually. We know that a lot of these increases, especially at the middle, are the housing bubble. So once you exclude home housing wealth here, you see that the increase in median net worth was actually driven entirely by housing. And it already started declining in the early 2000s. Since 2001, the typical American family has lost wealth not held in housing. But the housing bubble has served to sort of give that illusion that hasn't. So the data, I'm going to be light on sort of the details of the data I'm using, but I'm happy to answer any additional questions. Most of the data I'll show you today comes from the Pound Study of Income Dynamics, and where it comes from other data sources, I hope to point it out. The main wealth measure I'm going to show you today is the net worth measure, measured at the family level, so the sum of all assets minus debts, and we already realized that there are parts of them may be missing, such as pensions. They're averaged across multiple years to reduce measurement error, and there are a whole lot of other concerns about wealth measures that we don't have to the same extent with other measures such as income. For example, nonlinearities, and you'll see much more about this, sort of how to deal with the nonlinear effects of wealth. Wealth can also be negative as net debt, especially post-recession. We see a lot of that. And you don't just have to deal with this empirically, but also there are likely very different effects of net debt as opposed to net worth. So I'll start off with just a basic descriptive question asking, how rigid is the wealth distribution? We've seen it's unequal. The question is, how rigid is it over generations? Is that inequality in one generation reproduced in the other? And one way to look at this is just to correlate wealth across generations. Now, of course, there is a large literature on these intergenerational correlations. Sociologists have focused on classes or occupational status. Economists have focused on income. And there has been one study on intergenerational wealth correlations. The problem with that, it's a fantastic study. The problem is, at the point, they had to rely on parents' reports and then track their kids for only 15 years. So the kids were only 15 years older than when we assessed parents. And we know from the literature on income correlations that introduces a big life cycle bias. So the simple exercise here is to update that, drawing on more recent data from the PSID. We pick up the parents in 1984, and we track down their kids in 2011 and see how similar they are in terms of their wealth holding. This is how economists normally do these, intergenerational elasticity. So you basically just try to predict children, so C is children's wealth with parents' wealth, and then you control for age in both generations, squared as a normal term. And then you look at this elasticity, since it's locked on both sides, this is an elasticity. This is the standard way to look at intergeneration correlation in economics. It's, I think, more appreciated now that has some challenges. So first of all, it's this assumption that this is a constant elasticity, so that it's a linear effect, which, from what we've seen, sort of the fanning out of the wealth distribution is probably not going to be the case, and we'll see that. It's sensitive to changes in the margins, too. So if I wanted to compare these across groups, and the groups differ in terms of their distribution of wealth, that's going to impact my elasticity, too. And then finally, it's restricted to individuals with positive net worth, because you want to log it, right? So it's just the modeling framework that has been used, and that I think in this application is problematic. So I'm also moving to something else, which is just rank correlation. So you rank both generations and then correlate them. And that has the advantage of including people at the very bottom, and it's margin insensitive. So here are the quick numbers. I hope you can see them fine. This is the elasticity. So if you believed in this constant elasticity assumption and this linear effect, that would mean if you double parents' wealth, so an increase by 100%, if you double parents' wealth, their kids' wealth goes up by 40%. That's the elasticity, intergenerational elasticity of wealth. And this is a rank correlation. So this is just like any other correlation we're used to between 0 and 1, right? So I think there are some interesting comparisons. You could do that for males and females. Much lower elasticity for females. You see that in the income literature too. But I just told you that these are margin insensitive. Margin sensitive. So to the degree that the wealth distribution differs for males and females, this is going to be impacted. And also to the degree that the share of non-positive wealth holders differs between those, it's also going to be impacted. So in fact, if you look at the rank correlations, which is what I argued is more meaningful, you see that they're pretty similar. So you want to look at these wealth correlations, and I think the main result I want to show you today is just if you break this out by groups. So the prior research has really relied on these two first groups because they didn't have more data. Correlation of 0.5, 0.25, 0.4. But then among the older generation, these are really much higher correlations. So we really underestimated the intergenerational elasticity of wealth based on that. So that one or actually a few prior studies. This is just sort of the linear world, and in fact, to make sense of why this goes up so much, let me show you a mobility table where we just plot wealth quintiles in both generations. So parents' wealth quintile, low to high, and children's wealth quintile at the higher age. So what's gray here is basically immobility, right? So if you come from the lowest wealth quintile, your odds of ending up in the lowest quintile is 1 in 25%. If you come from the highest wealth quintile, your odds of also ending up in the highest quintile is more than half. So you see that this concentration of intergenerational transmission is especially pronounced at the top, as we might expect. So that potentially also makes sense of the finding I showed you before, where the older people get, the more similar they become to their parents, and that is because some of them move up, and a lot of them move up to their high wealth level over time. So we really need to look at this sort of in old adulthood. Okay, I'm going to use one more thing from that paper that's actually collaborative with Alexandra Killewald, and then we're going to keep working on a bit. The question is, these elasticities, can we explain them in some way? So for example, do they occur through bequests or gifts? In the PSID, we actually measure that. So I count up, so every wave we ask, do you receive any large gift or inheritance? And I count it up across the full observation period and see whether entering that into that equation mediates some of that elasticity. And 12%, it's not a whole lot. You might have concerns about measurement of inheritance. I've tried other things like parental death. Is one of your parents or are both of your parents dead already? That should be a proxy for some bequesting behavior. Doesn't do anything. Instead, what does have a much larger effect is transmission through education. So if you control for kids' educational attainment, 30% of their intergenerational wealth transmission is accounted for. So this is the lead-in now for me for the rest of the talk. That's really going to focus on this role of wealth transmission through education. This is the second descriptive piece I want to use then. Wealth gaps in education have recently been studied. People have found those. But we don't know whether they have increased and just how big they are in comparison to other gaps. There's lots of interest right now in increasing income inequality in educational outcomes. And as I would argue, we should be worried just as much, if not more, about increasing wealth inequality. And here is why. I'll show you. For this exercise, I'm following children who were born in the 70s and 80s. And I pick up their parents' wealth when they were sort of in childhood, 10 to 14 years of age. And then I look at their educational attainment when they're 20 and 25. Okay? So this is the wealth gap as we see it on the PSID. Here is the wealth quintile of the parents. So you come from the lowest wealth quintile. And here are your graduation rates. High school, college attendance, or college entry, and college graduation. So among kids from the lowest wealth quintile, which in this case happens to be basically people without wealth or negative wealth, the high school graduation rate is 65%, college entrance 15%, college graduation less than 10%. If you go all the way up, you see pretty high high school graduation rates. You see that half of the kids from high wealth households enter college, and also have graduate from college. So this is a big story of college persistence too, right? So this gap between attendance and graduation closes for the top. If you're from the top, your odds of going to college are 1 and 2, and your odds of graduating from college are basically 1 and 2 also. That's a big gap. Now you might say, just look at the left side, please. This is what I just showed you. This is just a different display of comparing the highest wealth quintile, the fourth, the third, the second to the lowest. So we already saw this gap in high school graduation. 26 percentage point gap in high school graduation between the top and the bottom quintile. Or for college, a 40% percentage point difference in college graduation rates, top versus bottom. Now, of course, you can say, well, these people different other characteristics. Yes, they do. I try to control for most of those. So, first of all, we want to control for income, permanent income, average across 10 years, for occupations, for parents' education, for demographic characteristics, for race, and all of sort of our normal suspects. And as you would expect, these differences go down, but they're still pretty sizable and significant. So there is still a 10 percentage point gap in high school graduation and college graduation between those two groups. So they're really, independent associations between parents' wealth and their kids' educational outcomes. And they're, by the way, I'm not showing this here, they're bigger than the income gaps, much bigger, in fact. This is nearly double the size. So when you do a horse race between income and wealth, which is what lots of economists are interested in, they're about double the size of the income gaps in education. Conditional. Okay, last descriptive piece, and then I'll show you that I also care about theory and thinking through this, is to track this over time and ask, so has this increase in wealth inequality also translated to an increase in wealth gaps? And the way I displayed it here is I basically show you sort of the last part of that cohort that you've just seen and the first part. So kids born in the early 70s and kids born in the early 70s versus kids born in the early 80s. And these are kids born in the early 80s. This is the difference in graduation rates to those born in the early 70s. So these are this here is the increase in the gap, right? this increases 15 percentage, no, not quite. More. No, I should know the number. It's more than 15 percentage points. So, in just 10 years, mind you, in just 10 years, the very top of the wealth distribution, or the top 20%, have taken off by an additional 15 percentage points in graduation rates. To me, that's a pretty stark increase in a very brief period of time. If by now you think I'm overstating things, then I'm going to totally lose you here. And this is a bit tongue-in-cheek. The question is, where do these? What are the sources of these growing gaps? And you could basically decompose them into an increasing effect of parents' wealth, or just So whether parental wealth has become more important, or whether it's just the fact that parents have moved away from each other, right? You might suspect that it's entirely feasible that wealth has become more important. So these are, for example, college tuition costs over the last 30 years, right? For 4 years, private and public, inflation adjusted. However, if I look at it and sort of want to know whether it's really that the importance of wealth has increased, or that it's just a translation of the wealth inequality, it's really the latter. It's the fact has remained pretty stable, but it's the fact that parents have pulled apart so much from each other that accounts for most of these increases in the gaps. So based on that, the tongue-in-cheek exercise could be, what does that imply for the future? Remember the picture I showed you before. The increase in wealth inequality that we've just tracked for these kids, that was the increase in wealth inequality here. That was the period I looked at, right? So remember that 15 percentage point takeoff? That was the cohort I looked at. That's when they were growing up. So of course, we already know what has happened to the wealth distribution since then. Wealth inequality has really taken off since then. So in some sense, if you were willing to make a whole lot of assumptions, you could say, okay, if it's really that the pulling apart accounts for these increasing wealth gaps, let's just impute that and let's just project that forward. So what does that increase in wealth inequality imply for the wealth gaps? And I won't walk you through the details of that decomposition, because I think it is tongue-in-cheek. It basically says if an increase in the wealth gaps translates into if an increase in wealth inequality translates into increasing wealth gaps in education to the same degree that it did in the past, and we know what happened to wealth inequality, this is what would happen. And this is basically the number you can impute. So the wealth gap between the top and the bottom, the college graduation gap between the top and the bottom would be 71 percentage points. Okay. I think that's just an illustration sort of to make clear what we're facing. We certainly don't want to assume that nothing else changes in life, but I think that's pretty rough prediction, and hopefully sort of a call for action. Okay, that was my rushing through the descriptives. Do you have questions so far? Otherwise, let me know if you don't believe it, because then I don't need to explain it.
I'm sorry, this may be a silly question showing my ignorance, but did I understand correctly in one of the graphs that 50% go up to conversion? So it's only 50% of students in the highest wealth levels that graduate?
Yeah.
So the other ones don't graduate from college? Are we assuming that I didn't know. So, because that seems like an incredibly low number of people graduating. Do we know why? And what happens to those folks?
Sorry, I mean, compared to our overall graduation rates, it's not entirely surprising to me, but you're right. I've gotten that comment before. If you think of the top wealthy kids, the assumption is everyone graduates from college. I don't think I have a good answer for you, but
They get trust funds become ski bumps.
Yeah, I'll come back to that point actually. So I don't observe these people here.
Just a question. I mean, they start college but don't graduate because...
No, they don't. They start at the graduate, but there is a size of the group that doesn't go to college.
Well, I learned something.
And you're right, and I'll revisit sort of Dark's point about these ceiling effects at the top, right? If you have so much wealth that you really don't need education, right? That's a good point.
Yeah, but 50%, that 50%. I can understand that.
Yeah.
The small group that doesn't need education, but then it's very likely.
Yeah.
So there was another interesting aspect of the slide about three before this one. That one more. One more.
This?
I think that's so. And I don't think you commented much on, and that's the gap between who goes to college and who graduates from college.
Mm-hmm.
So that gap is the biggest for the middle class, and I wonder if to some extent that's a function of financial aid policies that target the lowest income group, and it's the middle class that's in the squeeze.
Yeah. I think that's a very good point. There is sort of a study I'm trying to do right now is I realized at some point through this that there is a fantastic policy discontinuity contained in here. So I'm not getting at it with the cohorts the way I divide them up. But there, in 1992, the Higher Education Reform Act started to exclude housing wealth from the calculation of financial aid, which I think should have this big effect on middle class earners. So if your income was low enough that you would qualify for financial aid, but you actually had a lot of housing wealth, all of a sudden you have this influx in college funding because basically now your housing wealth was disregarded. And I'm in that, and it's a nice discontinuity. It got implemented relatively quickly, and I cover this within here. So far I haven't been able to track it down, but that is my hope that I can address that eventually to show that there's really these middle class households that have, where the wealth effect is a big one, and through that policy change. Okay, other questions? Good, then I'll move on. So, in thinking through where these wealth effects come from, I'm going to walk you through sort of the general, the family of mechanisms I could envision. But what I really want to push for today is what I would call the insurance function of wealth. And I want to give you sort of the theoretical framework for that, and then some evidence from cross-national comparisons and from within countries. So why should parental wealth matter? So it comes a bit late in the talk, but this is how I was trying it this time. So I would distinguish a purchasing function and an insurance function of wealth. So on the one hand, parents' wealth can really purchase access to educationally valuable goods. Right? So we could think of advantageous neighborhoods and schools. So the way we're setting up our public education finances is by linking it through to home values. So that would make a whole lot of sense that by building wealth through housing, you also gain access to these advantageous neighborhoods. Also, having a large savings account might alleviate credit constraints for post-secondary education. For those of you who have college kids, they probably know that that's how it sometimes works. But in addition to that, I want to say, so this I think is sort of intuitive. This is what everyone has focused on, and partly because all of this literature is focused on the US. We know, that segregation is high in neighborhoods. We know that public funding in schools is very unequal. We know that higher education is costly. But I think in addition to that, there is a more fundamental function of wealth that I'm going to talk about in a second. And then there is this whole, concern about unobserved heterogeneity. This is all driven by risk aversion, time preferences, and I have a spiel on that too, and I'd be happy to talk about it. But here's what I think is important and sort of not fully appreciated. When I say insurance effects of parental wealth, what I mean is that parental wealth has the potential to buffer the socioeconomic and socio-psychological consequences of negative outcomes in offspring's career paths. So how would that work? Others, by the way, have realized that too. Two good reviews of wealth and sociological approaches to wealth focus on wealth as a consumption potential. So not as consumption, but as a consumption potential, right? It allows you to do stuff. You don't have to do it, but it allows you to do it. And on the real and psychological safety nets of wealth. So the basic idea is, if you face a risky decision, and such as, for example, an educational decision, which involves risk, I'll talk about that, whether you're going to make that jump or not really depends on what the consequences of the failure is, right? So if there is a safety net, you might be willing to make the jump. If there's no safety net, you might not be willing to. I think that's sort of an easy way to state it. The challenge is you don't actually have to observe any transfer of money. Any of the purchasing that you could observe doesn't have to happen, right? Because if you don't fail, there is nothing that is being transferred. So that also makes it very hard to identify empirically. Here is my try. So I don't actually say identifying the insurance function. Note that I say adding credibility, and it comes from three seemingly disparate sort of approaches. One is a cross-national comparison, and then there are a couple of other things I'll talk about too. If you're interested, my larger research agenda in this area also tries to add credibility to this purchasing function. The one study that I just mentioned that I'm working on, this policy discontinuity, is one example, and also a new study based on new data from the PSID that actually measures intergenerational transfers. That has just come out. And also reducing worries about unobserved bias. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you're interested in. So the cross-national comparison, and I think since I'm a Wisconsin PhD, I should never give a presentation without. Oh no, this comes later. Well, now you can guess for like 3 minutes what a stratification scholar from Wisconsin needs to show. Sarah probably knows. Three cases that I'm studying. One is the United States, one is Germany, and one is Sweden. This is, of course, based on them being interesting comparative cases and on having the data to do this. You can't do this in many more other contexts, but it's a nice set of countries. It's sort of the classical representatives of welfare regimes that some of the mobility literature focuses on. And they're also quite different in terms of their institutional and policy contexts. And I don't think here I sort of need to go into the details. I'm pretty sure every one of you has sort of a basic understanding of how the policy and educational contexts look in these countries. What is probably more surprising to you is that the level of wealth inequality is very similar, actually, across these countries. These are Gini coefficients, and you do see that in the US there is a bit more concentration at the very top. But it's not that Sweden would occur here as normal as this very egalitarian society. So the first comment actually is relevant here. Pensions are not included. So here is a dependency on institutions. The private wealth of Swedes might be just as unequally distributed as the private wealth of Americans and Germans, but they have a very well-functioning, but they have a socialized pensions, right? So they have a social system of pension savings. So everyone, even the people in debt, have accumulated pensions to a much larger degree than Social Security accumulates here in the US. So once you try to factor that in, inequality does come down a little. But for the questions I'm interested in here, it's actually the question is whether you want to factor that in. But, okay. So different contexts, similar wealth inequality. So how should wealth then matter differently across these two contexts? And the prediction is sort of simplistically shown here. In the US, I already said, this purchasing function of wealth has a lot of feasibility. In Germany and Sweden, it really doesn't. So, for example, the way the public schools are financed is not tied to wealth. the entry costs to higher education are basically non-existent in terms of monetary terms. In fact, in Sweden, you're paid a pretty sizable stipend to attend university. So the purchasing function, in my view, doesn't have a whole lot of purchasing power here. The insurance function, however, might. So to the degree that risk is really inherent in any type of educational decision-making, an insurance effect should also occur in all of these contexts. And in fact, I'm not going to talk about the first part here, but that has been sort of acknowledged in the baseline models of rational choice and educational attainment, where it's really all about risk in education and your decision making depending on that risk. And the risk, just to be clear here, is the failure to graduate, right? For example, in college, you attend college, you don't graduate, that's a risk. You incur opportunity costs that you can't make up for because you don't have a degree. You might have social stigma attached to being a dropout, and so on. And these arguably are pretty universal characteristics of educational decision making. And in fact, I would even be willing to argue that in these two European contexts, the risks are even higher. That is, the need for insurance is even higher. Why? First of all, there are much higher opportunity costs of university attendance because the returns to college degree are not as great in Europe as they are here. You can have, livable earnings if you don't go to college, basically. So by going to college, you're incurring higher opportunity costs. Also, the uncertainty of success is higher in some contexts. So in the German system, especially, where basically it's an overstatement too, but it's sort of after fourth grade that you're deciding whether you're going to go to university or not. That's how the system is set up. I have research on that too, and it just seems strange to Americans. It doesn't seem strange to Germans. So Sarah, this is it. Yeah.
So why does that make the uncertainty greater? It seems like after the fourth grade passing the test, you know you're getting to a group that's going to go.
Yeah, that's true, but it's early. So in some sense, okay, I see that. The decision-making process, the point of the decision is much early in life, where you have much more uncertainty about your sort of ability in doing this. So this is actually the problem with the system, that we think we can assign students to these tracks after observing their ability for 4 years. Yeah. That's the argument. Okay, so this is Wisconsin stratification research, blow from the past. But I think it's still a nice way. So status attainment models, these are structural equation models. And they're still a nice, back in the day they were called causal models, we're beyond that. But they're still a nice way to display conditional associations. Really the question here is, from that holy trinity, right, that has effects, so parents' education, parents' occupation, parents' income, on their kids' education and even their occupation. What happens to this once we add on wealth? And I'm doing that now in those three contexts. And it's a nice tip if we want to compare across contexts. It might be nice, a nice variety of details. These are measured at different time points and a measurement model behind it. But it's really a display of what's the overall role of wealth in these three contexts. So this is this has been replicated like 500 times. This is the US. So these are basically standardized regression coefficients. Okay, this is all linear, years of education, socioeconomic status, family income. It's a rough way to do it, but you typically see that among these spectrum characteristics, it's parental education that has the highest independent associations with educational outcomes of their kids, but that there are also other background effects controlling for education, such as their occupation and their income. So the question here now, and some of those go even beyond education, right? Conditional on educational attainment, exert effects on their occupational success. So the question I'm addressing here is what happens, and this is my back and forth, what happens if we add on wealth? So you see that wealth has these direct conditional associations with education and occupation, and they add on to the other things. And in fact, in the US, as I've shown you before, they really dominate the income effects. And income here is, again, measured across multiple years. Going forward, this is Germany. you see a similar pattern, right? It's again, parents' education is very important, but then the other factors too. And here, you see wealth adding on. Income is still, has an association, but you see that it's sort of on the same playing field as these other characteristics. Still lower than education, but there is this intergenerational wealth effect in Germany too. And then finally, Sweden. This is, so what I showed you before is based on the German sister study of the PSID, the socioeconomic panel. I haven't talked about fixed statistics or number of observations. This is sort of 1,000 people. This is about 1 million people. Slightly different data, Swedish registered data. There's also sort of an uncomfortable negative effect here that we're trying to make sense of, but and there could be a story about it. But basically, the main interest here is that there are also these independent wealth effects or associations in Sweden when you control for all the other things. That's just sort of a first look at it, and then we go in the paper. We go into more details, and we show that that holds across modeling frameworks, and the wealth effects really are independent of these other background effects in all three contexts, right? They share some commonalities that are less important than education, but just as or more important than these other background characteristics. Yeah, that's sort of other findings. So the reason why I showed you this was really to add a first bit of credibility to this insurance claim, right? So the idea being that insurance is a more fundamental function of parents' wealth when it comes to educational attainment, and it should hold in these three contexts, and it does hold. We see these intergenerational wealth effects. That's one piece, so I'll pile on a few others, and I think I'll jump this one and come to more interesting. Yeah, I'll focus on this one. I think it's most interesting. So another fantastic advantage of using register data is that you can do a whole lot of things because you have more people. So we have field of study in our data, and what we're trying to do is think through ways in which in education you face uncertainty or risk and how that relates to parents' wealth. So one indicator that we came up with, this is work with a Swedish collaborator, Martin Helston, is the variance in the earnings expectations of certain degrees, of certain fields of study. Right? So it's not about average earnings, it's about the variance in earnings. And the story is basically this. If you come from a high wealth household, you might be more willing to pick a major that has less certain earnings expectations. You might be, for God's sake, crazy enough to study sociology or philosophy. And we can do that. We have actual choices, and we have stated preferences too from application registers. And we can show that parents' wealth strongly predicts, I'm not showing you the numbers, but it strongly predicts the choice of the field in the way that kids from high wealth households are much more likely to pick fields with high earnings variance, controlling for the expected average earnings. But they're willing to incur that risk of not knowing exactly how high your earnings are going to be. And these wealth effects are really the main predictor, unlike parents' education and others. So that's another piece that we want to add on, to make a claim for the insurance function. And then finally, and this is not quite finished, but I want to show you sort of where my thinking is going. Another, from one of these examples, another instance where I think there is a great opportunity to observe a behavior driven by risk or insurance needs is what has been called sort of a gap year apprenticeship in Germany. So basically, the typical German apprenticeship system that you may be familiar with is designed so that graduates from secondary schools of lower status can go into 3-year apprenticeships and then go into skilled labor occupations. And then the highly selected group early on goes to college. Well, that has changed to the degree that a lot of students who graduate from the highest secondary schools who are supposed to go to college, before they go to college, they do 3 years of apprenticeship. And my hunch is that a lot of this is risk avoidance. So the typical case of that is, before studying business, you do an apprenticeship in a bank. Because if B-School doesn't work out, you can always go back to be a bank teller, right? So these gap apprenticeships are probably a strategy to avoid some of those risks, or to absorb some of those risks. And if that's true, then following sort of my framework, they should also, so these decisions to make these gap year apprenticeships should also be driven by parents' wealth. And I'd love to say that's the case, but I don't know yet. So that's an analysis I'm running right now. Okay, it's basically 45, so I'll just sum up real quick. There's high and rising wealth inequality across the distribution, particularly since the Great Recession. There is strong intergenerational transmission of inequality, and it comes to full blossom in older adulthood. We should, worry about this when we sort of look at the early estimates of that. And there is especially high rigidity at the top. There are large wealth gaps in education that actually underlie some of these intergenerational transmission processes. They're at all levels, but particularly in college persistence. And these increasing wealth gaps might just be the beginning of a bleaker future. And then finally, the mechanisms I just went through was really sort of this plug to appreciate another role of parents' education in providing these safety nets. Okay? Thank you.